What's up, you guys? My name is Aubrey and this is my channel, and today I want to talk about some of the biggest financial mistakes that I've made in my life and in my career. These are all things that if I could go back in time, I probably would do things quite a bit differently. So I want to break down some of the mistakes that I've made, what I wish I would have done versus what I actually did. So let's get started. So I am 27 years old. I just turned 27 last month, and even though I am really happy with how things are going with my finances, my career, and just my life in general, there are of course things that if I could go back in time, I would have done them differently. I would have avoided them altogether. I would have changed the way that I approached it. Now with that, let's dig into the first financial mistake, which I suppose isn't really a mistake, more of a missed opportunity, and that is not house hacking and not house hacking as early as I could have started. Now, to give you guys some context, I'm 27 years old now, and I started investing in the stock market whenever I was a teenager in high school. Now, I invested in the American Airlines stock, which ultimately ended up going up quite significantly over a short period of time. And by the time I was a freshman in college, I had about $100,000 sitting in my investment account ready to go into some sort of investment. I ultimately ended up using that money to invest into a franchise. And while this was going on, I was living with my parents as a way to save money. I lived with my parents until I was 21 years old. I then moved in with my then boyfriend, now fiance, in an apartment, and then after about a year in the apartment, we moved into a house together, which we now currently live in and own. Now that is the path that I took, and now as I sit here today in 2020, I have one property that I own and that I live in, and I'm looking at buying 1 to 2 rental properties this year. But if I could go back in time, I would have done things quite a bit differently, and I probably would have bought a multi-unit property with a portion of that investment money. I would have lived in that property, I would have house hacked, and then I would have rinsed and repeat the process multiple times between 18 years old and today. Now, had I gone the house hacking route, I think I probably could have had multiple units and multiple properties by now sitting in 2020. But because I didn't go the house hacking route, I now just have one single property, and I am looking at getting a second and third property. Now, granted, I could still do house hacking today in 2020, but the interest of living in a multi-unit property at this point is just something that I'm not super interested in, and I feel as though this would have been a better fit in my early 20s rather than in my late 20s. So if I could go back in time, I definitely would have moved out of my parents' house earlier. I would have bought a multi-unit property. I would have house hacked that property for a few years. I then would have rinsed and repeated that process until today, sitting in 2020. So if I could go back in time, I definitely would have gone that route rather than stay with my parents until I was 21 and rather than renting an apartment for a year while I was figuring out where I wanted to live long term. The second financial mistake that I think a lot of young people make, and I know I made it myself, is not saving enough of my income earlier on in my life. Now, I started working whenever I was 16, and I think like a lot of the younger audience members watching this YouTube channel, you may have started working at 16, 17, or 18 years old. But I think like many teenagers, I viewed this extra income coming from my part-time job as just kind of slush money. I was able to spend that money on whatever I wanted to because I didn't have a whole lot of bills. My living expenses were really cheap because I was still living with my parents. And as a result, I blew my money on a lot of stupid purchases. Now, some of these purchases were solid purchases. For example, my desktop computer that I use today for my full-time work is one I bought in high school using my part-time job. So there was a handful of really good investments that I made over this period of time. But for the most part, I blew a lot of money on stupid purchases like things that I never ended up using, like fast food and so much more. I think that one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give to any younger teenager or somebody who's still living with your parents is to really take advantage of that time and to save as much of your income as you possibly can. Because that saved income can really make a big difference in your life later on down the road, whereas that extra fast food meal, that kind of frivolous purchase, that impulse buy, those things are going to be really easily forgotten. And if you can save a whole lot of your income while your living expenses are low, you can then use that income to do something more meaningful later on, like house hack, for example. So though the mistake of not saving more of my income while I was younger is certainly not a detrimental mistake, and it's a mistake that a whole lot of younger people make, if I could go back in time and talk to my younger self, I would certainly tell myself to save as much money as possible while my living expenses are low, and then use that money towards a meaningful investment later on down the road whenever it can really be a meaningful purchase, something like a house, a down payment on an investment, or something like that. And the third financial mistake that I made in my late teens and early 20s is investing all of my money into one single business. Now, I bought a franchise in my early 20s, and ultimately I put all of the money that I had made in the stock market into that business. But if I could go back in time, I probably would have diversified my investments quite a lot more. I would have put some of my money into a like brick and mortar or a traditional business. I would have put some of my money into an investment property, and then I would have put the rest into the stock market. Instead, I shoveled all of the money that I had into this single business opportunity. Now, ultimately, at the time that I made this business decision, I was only 20 years old, and I believed that this was the right route to go down. And looking back on it, I don't necessarily think that it was a huge mistake, but I feel as though my money could have been better invested. So though I learned an absolute ton from the experience that I had in investing all of my money into a single business, I probably would have been more diversified. I would have invested into different things, and I would have been probably a bit smarter with the allocation of my investment if I could go back in time. So all in all, you guys, I am a huge believer in the fact that in order to learn, you need to make mistakes. And I have certainly made a ton of mistakes over my career. But ultimately, these 3 mistakes that I've talked about today, not diversifying, not house hacking, and not saving my money earlier on in my career, are 3 mistakes that if I could go back in time, I probably would have changed the way that I did things altogether. But with that being said, I would love to hear your thoughts, so make sure to leave me a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell. And I will see you guys in the next video.